Welcome to our program. Today in many of our universities, our students are taught that America was not founded as a Christian nation, that our founding fathers were not Christians, and that they didn't want to establish our government on Christian principles. Well, in this series of programs, we've already seen that's a lie. And today we're going to continue to provide the evidence that shows what our founding fathers really believed. We start by examining the first collective act of our founding fathers as can be established by investigating the congressional records. Our guest today is David Barton, who's an expert on the writings of the founding fathers and early American history. I'd like you to listen.
Dr. William James, called the father of modern psychology, said there's nothing so absurd but that if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. And that certainly happened today with America's history. Today we're told, no, we're not a Christian nation. The founding fathers didn't want religious principles. They were all deists anyway. They didn't want religious activities. And we've been told that again and again and again. In recent years, the U.S. Supreme Court has decreed that the founding fathers would never have wanted students to be exposed to the acknowledgement of God. They would not want students exposed to prayer. Universities today not only teach students, they test them that not one single one of the founding fathers even believe in God. Well, this is what we're told, but is it accurate? It's absolutely not accurate. It can be easily disproven even by the records of the U.S. Supreme Court itself. For you see, we have the writings of the founding fathers and the official acts of the founding fathers as recorded in the records of Congress, the congressional records, and the very first action, the collective action of these founding fathers itself, disproves the assertion that they were deists and that they did not want religious principles involved. The first act collectively of the founding fathers occurred in 1774. At that time, we were 2 years away from the Declaration. We were still loyal British subjects, loyal British citizens in British colonies, but we recognized that we might not be able to reconcile our differences with Great Britain. So the founding fathers said, why don't we learn to govern ourselves? They had never done that before. So in 1774, they convened the first Congress of the United States, the 1774 Provincial Congress. And that's where the records of Congress start, with 1774. Do you know what the first act was of these first founding fathers? The founding fathers that gave us our founding documents, their first act in that first Congress, they opened with prayer. No, but it wasn't a dinky little prayer that said, God bless this Congress kind of prayer. According to the writings of those who participated in it, they opened with a 3-hour prayer session in Congress. A 3-hour prayer session to open Congress. Now, many of them wrote about it. One of them wrote and said, throughout the prayer time, Washington and Henry were kneeling there. Jay and Rutledge were kneeling there. Another one afterwards said, after that 3 hours of prayer, even the stern old Quakers had tears running down their cheeks.
Now, because our founding fathers were such prolific writers, we know that they not only had a prayer meeting, but what happened in their prayer meeting and the events surrounding it. David Barton explains.
Well, perhaps there's no better description of what went on in that prayer time than the letters between John and Abigail Adams. Now, those are fascinating letters. They're worth reading. You can get them at a local library. You'll never see letters written back and forth between two people that have as much scripture as those letters have back between John and Abigail. John told Abigail what had happened that morning, and in his writing to Abigail, he said, just this morning we had heard that Great Britain had opened fire on Boston, and that's a great concern because we were still British subjects. We did not have an army. We did not have a navy. We had no way to defend ourselves, and so they were greatly concerned. But John told Abigail, he said, but our psalm for this morning was Psalm 35. He said, I beg you, read that psalm. He said, God used Psalm 35 to put our hearts at rest. We know it's going to be all right. We prayed Psalm 35 as a Congress this morning, and Psalm 35 is an excellent prayer for these people, particularly feeling that they had an unprovoked attack coming at them. Now, Congress read and prayed Psalm 35 over a 3-hour period. Well, John continued a very faithful correspondence with Abigail, and another letter that he gave to Abigail, he told her, he said, today, Congress did one of the wisest things it could possibly have done. He said, today we called for a national day of prayer and fasting. And he told her, he said, we've appointed a continental fast. He said millions will be upon their knees at once before their great Creator, imploring His forgiveness and His blessings, His smiles on American counsel and arms. And he told Abigail, he said, Abigail, can you imagine the impact of having millions of people upon their knees at once praying to God? Now, this is a very common act of our founding fathers. They called for national days of prayer and thanksgiving on a very regular basis. They were very specific in their prayer request. They were very emphatically Christian in their prayer request. They called the nation to prayer and fasting time after time after time. And they were so serious about it that when they called for a national day of prayer and fasting, businesses shut down so that they could dedicate the entire day to seriously fasting and praying for the nation. It was a time of serious prayer.
Now, it's surprising to some people to find out that our founding fathers spent serious time in prayer. But it's shocking for some to discover that the Congress itself faithfully recorded answers to prayer in the congressional record. David Barton tells us about it.
But what's also fascinating is the fact that Congress itself was a very faithful recorder of God answering prayers. You see, when God answered one of those days of prayer and fasting, Congress would then turn around, document the answers to the prayers, and would then proclaim a national day of prayer and thanksgiving. And in that day of prayer and thanksgiving, they would list all the specifics, how God had answered their prayers throughout. Now, in one of these days of thanksgiving, John Adams again wrote Abigail, and he said, you know, we've had this day of prayer and fasting. He said, you wouldn't believe what's going on now. And he gave her 5 examples of things that should not have happened. And again, this was still before we'd officially separated from Great Britain. We had no army. We had no navy of our own. What we were just individual citizens starting to stand and rise and fight, groups like the Minutemen. We didn't even have an organized militia yet. And yet John Adams said, after that last day of prayer and fasting, he said, Colonel Smith and a group of our militia, now this is American farmers basically, said captured a British fort. Now, Britain is the #1 military power in the world. And here one of our colonels with a handful of soldiers captures a British fort with the loss of no lives. Then John went on to say, he said, on another occasion, he said, one of our little galleys captured a 64-gun British man-of-war and captured a 20-gun British man-of-war. Now, we did not have our own Navy. Our Navy, very literally, amounted to a rowboat with a cannon each end. I mean, we still have some of those ships left from the early years of the American Revolution. At best, we could mount 2, 4, 6 guns in a ship. And yet we captured a 64-gun British man-of-war? How can that be explained? Well, this is the way John Adams explained it to Abigail in his letter. He told Abigail, he said, it appears to me that the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. Now, this is what the Founding Fathers put in their own writings, and they were very faithful in prayer throughout. Now, the Founding Fathers, in all this time of prayer, it's inconceivable that people who call the nation to prayer, who have such a firm reliance on God, would want a policy that would prohibit students from having the opportunity to voluntarily pray. Now, our first official act of the Founding Fathers completely disproves any notion that they wanted to separate religious principles from public affairs.
Now, almost all Americans have heard of Benedict Arnold. We all know that he tried to betray our country and committed treason. But what most Americans don't know is that George Washington cited the discovery of Benedict Arnold's plan as proof that God was protecting the nation and had directly intervened on our behalf. Listen.
And the journals of Congress themselves indicate many records that the Founding Fathers had strongly Christian notions of what they wanted in the nation, as seen in their days of prayer and thanksgiving and in their proclamations for prayer and fasting. For example, just a matter of a few weeks before they signed the Declaration of Independence, their final plea for reconciliation with Great Britain had been rejected by King George III. And so now they knew that they must go to war. There was no resolving the differences. So understanding that the nation would soon be at war, Congress met. They called for a national day of prayer and fasting, knowing that if we expected to have God's blessings on the nation, we better make sure we were right with God before we went in. And so look at this proclamation given on May the 16th, 1776, by our Founding Fathers. This is what they asked the nation to do. They said that Congress do earnestly recommend a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that we may with united hearts confess and bewail our manifold sins and transgressions, and that we may by sincere repentance and amendment of life, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, obtain His pardon and forgiveness. Now, that's not a bland declaration by the Founding Fathers. They said we need to get a hold of Jesus and make sure that we have a changed life, make sure that we get His pardon and His forgiveness. We need His help before we go to war. And that's what Congress called the nation to pray and do before we entered into the Declaration of Independence. Now, sometime after that, we had several occasions where the Congress would document days of prayer and fasting. Perhaps one of the more infamous is that concerning the treason attempt of Benedict Arnold. For Benedict Arnold had been a great general in the American cause. He had won battles. He had been one of our great allies, and yet he had opportunity that he betrayed his country. And so the plan that he worked out with Major Andre of the British was a very well-conceived plan. It should never have been discovered, particularly the way that they found the plans inside Major Andre's boots. Well, when Washington found out about the treason attempt, how it had been discovered, he interviewed the men that had been on duty. He said it was very clear that God had directly intervened. Even the men that had captured Major Andre said, we didn't intend to ask the questions that we asked, but we asked questions that caused him to have to respond in a way that we found out something was not right. And so they themselves felt like that what had happened was outside of their control, that God had intervened, And Washington documented that in a report back to Congress on the 26th of September, 1780. And he told Congress all about the treason attempt and how God had intervened. And he said, had not God intervened in this, he said, by now West Point would have fallen into the hands of the British, America would have received a fatal stab, we'd be no more. He said, the indications of God's hand in this are so clear that it again proves that the liberties of America are the object of his divine love. Now this was Washington's official report back to Congress on the treason attempt. When Congress got that report, they responded and they called for a day of national prayer and thanksgiving. And they detailed to the nation on October the 18th, 1780, all the specifics that God had done in intervening to discover that treason attempt. And so they called the nation to do two things. They said, number one, we want you to stop and thank God that again, he's intervened in our behalf, showing that we're the objects of his divine love. And two, we have a prayer request for you. Now they said, first off, we want to call a day of public thanksgiving and prayer